Welcome to our second session, which is called When Two Tribes Go to War, Polarization and Science Communication. And when we came up with the title for this session back in July of last year, we didn't realize just how timely it would be. And we've already heard from Francis Collins that polarization is one of the key issues for the country at this time. Before we begin with the panel, I would just like to ask you a question. Who in this room places a high value on scientific expertise and research? Please put your hands up. Okay, that's very interesting. So that was, I think, 97% of the room, which suggests that we are, in some ways, a like-minded group, and I will come back to that because that's important. We're constantly hearing that we're living in an increasingly polarized country and world, a world where people, as many people say, no longer inhabit the same reality. But what is polarization? How does it relate to misinformation? How does it affect trust in science and in our institutions? So all the way back in 1951, Solomon Asch performed a very famous experiment in Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. Groups of 8 participants were invited to identify pairs of lines on cards that were the same length. The answer was completely obvious, but all but one of the participants were really confederates of the experimenter and had been instructed to all agree on the incorrect answer in 12 of the tests. What happened? Well, it turned out that over 75% of the real participants gave the obviously wrong answer in agreement with the Confederates at least once during the experiment, demonstrating the powerful psychological influence of group conformity. And regarding the study results, Asch stated that intelligent, well-meaning young people are willing to call white black is a matter of concern. So Asch's conformity experiment is a demonstration of social dynamics that are closely related to polarization, especially in relation to alternative facts. It has been well documented that when one has deliberation among like-minded people, for example, jurors, that there's a tendency to polarize towards a more extreme view and higher, more extreme awards or punishments than any of the individual jurors would have awarded on an individual basis. So we know that when you get like-minded groups together, and I think we've seen that we are broadly, in terms of our attitudes towards science and towards research, a like-minded group in this room, people tend to migrate towards more extreme positions. Cass Sunstein, the legal scholar, has stated that a sense of common fate and intergroup similarity tend to increase polarization, as does the introduction of a rival outgroup. So if we turn to science, why is it that some scientific topics seem to be highly polarizing, such as climate or vaccines, which we heard about in the last panel, and others seem not to be, such as fluid dynamics or gravitational waves? What do we really know about polarization in relation to science communication? And what communication tactics might we adopt to mitigate or reverse the effects of polarization? And perhaps equally important, what should we not do? What are the things we should not do in attempting to deal with a polarized science information landscape? To help us unpack these crucial questions, we're honored to have 3 distinguished panelists with us this morning. I would like to invite them up to the stage. Firstly, Lee McIntyre, a philosopher of science, a misinformation expert and author of Post-Truth, among many other books. And Lee's research explores the roots of science denial and the role of truth in democratic societies. Welcome, Lee. And Dietram Scheufele. Dietram is a leading scholar of what has become known as the science of science communication. His work focuses on the intersections of media, public opinion, and emerging technologies. Welcome, Dietram. And Finally, our most local person today, Lily Tsai. Lily is a political scientist, a former chair of the faculty here at MIT, which I can assure you is one of the most challenging jobs at MIT. And she's also the author of When People Want Punishment, Retributive Justice and the Puzzle of Authoritarian Popularity. So Lily's expertise is in governance and trust in our institutions and decision-making. Welcome, Lily. So I'll come over and join you. And so just as we start, we're going to be exploring together how polarization affects science and the communication around science, the strategies that can help us bridge divides, and also whether we have still any shared hope for an understanding of reality in a polarized world. So let's get started with really, the question of how did we get here? How did we come to be in this situation where topics that were previously regarded and where a body of science that was regarded as really something that was shared and a shared basis for understanding has become politicized. And I would like to turn to you first, Lee, as someone who has really looked at the question of misinformation and how polarization and misinformation interact. So how did we get here? How did we arrive at this polarized situation?
The primary thing we need to do, I think, is to recognize the distinction between misinformation, is when something is false, and disinformation, when it's deliberately false, and to recognize that there are malign actors who do have an interest in disinforming us about particular scientific topics. And that, by the way, is the answer to why we are polarized about climate change and evolution, but not about fluid dynamics. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because money, power, for whatever interests people might have in mind, they have discovered that it is to their benefit, either through the amassing of political power or more money, to have a public who does not agree with the scientific consensus. And once you create that sort of controversy and start to spread disinformation, terrible things happen. First, people begin to believe a falsehood. Second, they become polarized around that belief to the point where disinformation doesn't just get people to believe something false, it gets them to hate people who don't share that false belief. And you can kind of create tribes, you can create a war. And third, sometimes it makes people cynical. It makes people think, well, nobody really knows the answer to this. The experts disagree. I guess there is no answer, and so I can just stop trusting anyone. That, in some ways, is the worst part of it, because it erodes the trust, not only in scientific truth on one topic, like climate, but in all topics. Because if you no longer trust experts, if you no longer trust scientists, if you're polarized to the point where you see scientists as the elite who are against you, then it metastasizes. Then it goes beyond just the one topic, and that's awful for trust in science.
Dietram, from your point of view, you're someone who's taken a very data-driven approach to looking at questions around trust in science and polarization. How do you think we've ended up in this situation? Do you agree with Lee?
Yeah, I think there are tons of influences, and the previous panel already touched on some of them. Lee has. I'll start and pick up, Lee, where you left off, and that is the idea of trust in science in general. And I just want to throw out the idea that when we're shooting for public trust in science, we're not shooting for 100%. That would actually be democratically undesirable, right? We want a public who has a healthy level of skepticism as we're pushing the boundaries of what's possible for human brain organoids, for artificial intelligence, for new applications of human genome editing technologies. So it's probably a U-shaped curve in terms of whether Y is the democratic benefits of or a healthy interface that the public has with science, and the x-axis is 0 to 100. 0 is bad. If nobody trusts science, we're done, not just as science, but as a country. But if we reach 100%, we also have a real problem on our hands because we no longer have a healthy scientific discourse. So the secret is to strike to get at that relative or absolute maximum of that U-shaped curve. And I think there are tons of influences. We talked about social media and both the benefits, somebody raised that in the question, I can't remember, and some of the challenges of narrow casting toward publics who already have lower levels of trust and so on. And I don't want to go into that all that much. I want to carve out one in particular, and that is our own role in maybe having undermined some of that trust. And Francis alluded to this already during COVID. We were in this unenviable situation that we had to counter information that we knew to be wrong with science that we weren't quite sure would turn out to be right. And that was not a great situation to be in. It was necessary. But I think we doubled down on that in a couple ways that was not productive. One is, I think sometimes as a scientific community, we gratuitously signal our value misalignment with different publics. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. Neil deGrasse Tyson, at some point, I'll single him out unfairly, put a tweet out on Christmas Day where he said, a long time ago this day, a man was born who by the age of 30 would change the world. Happy birthday, Isaac Newton. Very funny. We all think it's funny, right? But trolling Christians on Christmas Day is probably not the conversation opener you want to have on stem cell research, on climate change, and all the disconnects that we heard Francis talk about with communities of faith. And it's unnecessary. It is not something that's particularly helpful. Neither is to call all Republicans unsafe to be in Congress, as some climate scientists have done, and so on. So I think that's a first problematic area for science. And the second one is that we've gotten into this habit of saying just follow the science. And that has become a credo in some communities, scientific communities. And AstraZeneca was a great example where Germany vaccinated large proportions of the population with AstraZeneca, where I'm from, including the chancellor who went on TV. Denmark, at almost the same time, said, this is not safe, we're not using it. In the US, stockpiled, but didn't really use it here in this country. 3 countries coming to opposite policy conclusions based on the exact same data. And they all engaged with the best science. They all followed the science, but they came to different policy conclusions. So by overclaiming that there are certain policy outcomes that science can determine, I think we're doing a disservice to science, because science can inform policy outcomes, but it should never, it cannot and it should never determine them.
Mm-hmm. And Lily, you've written about when people want punishment. And clearly the punishment is for other people, not for the people themselves. Do you think that we are now at a moment when people want science to be punished? And also, you've worked a lot about trust in science, trust in our institutions. How do you feel that trust in our institutions is playing out in this time of polarization?
Yeah, I mean, the book is provocatively titled When People Want Punishment, but more fundamentally, it's about how people expect authorities to uphold moral values. And I think that one important key to understanding the polarization of science has to do with the fact that science and scientists have political power, and they have political power over a lot of people. And so one thing that struck me about the recent Pew Research data that this panel, all of us, were looking at on trust in science is that Americans generally still have a high level of trust in science. What is striking to me is that half of Republicans and a quarter of Democrats don't believe that scientists share the moral or care about the moral values of society. So, one question to really ask all of us, all of ourselves, and myself as a scientist is, would I vote for somebody that I didn't think cared about the moral values of society? Would I take medical advice from somebody who I thought didn't care about the moral values of society? Would I buy baby food from them? Would I take a vaccine and have a shot in the arm, right? So to me, that's actually one incredibly revealing piece of information. And so then the question becomes, how did the belief in the values of scientists become polarized or partisan. And that, of course, has to do a lot with the fact that science and scientists were given a huge amount of power over during COVID. That also, of course, has to do with the amplification that social media creates with respect to polarization. But what I'm interested in are much longer term trends and cleavages. So let me just speak about 2 or 3 of those here. One is that the role of expertise in science and policy making has increased over the last 3 or 4 decades. So Noam Chomsky, some of you will remember, wrote this book called The New Mandarins. And so John F. Kennedy, his administration was really the first to promote this idea that policy making could be completely rational, could be based on expertise and technical, science-based, evidence-based data. And so as the decades have proceeded, the role of expertise and technocracy in policymaking has increased. So that's sort of one long-term trend. The second long-term trend that political scientists have paid a lot of attention to is something called the big sort, right? So all of us, I think, at this point realize that we've increasingly sorted ourselves into socially, economically, ethnically, politically homogenous small communities, right? So in the 1970s, during the presidential election for Carter versus Ford, only 25% of counties in the United States were overwhelmingly voting for the same party in a presidential election. Today, it's over 90%. Over 90% of American counties are essentially one-party counties. So that's at the political level. But we've also seen that with respect to religious homogeneity, ethnic homogeneity, socioeconomic homogeneity. How does this intersect with the polarization of science and universities? Well, it's also true for universities, right? So on the one hand, we've seen universities become more left-leaning. And then second, if you think about R1 universities in the United States, only a tiny, tiny handful are in rural red communities. Something like 20, 25 R1 universities are in towns that where the population is less than 100,000. And we know as political scientists that urban areas are overwhelmingly blue, right? So all of that, I think, winds up leading to the fact that science and scientists become viewed in a very partisan way, which again connects back to the initial question of why certain topics, right? So it has to do with medical advice, climate change, things that involve scientists and science exerting political power or political authority over the general public.
Thank you. And you've been talking about these longer-term trends, yeah. and you mentioned briefly social media. I suppose many people, also in the previous panel, there was discussion about how these effects are being amplified and accelerated by social media. And I was keen to explore to what extent that's true. We've seen recently, of course, Facebook changing its rules in terms of fact verification. We've seen what's happened with X. Maybe Dietram, you have looked a lot at this topic of social media in terms of science communication. Do you think that the kind of long-term effects that Lily has been discussing have been perhaps accelerated by what's happened recently with social media?
I mean, yes and no, and I think misinformation, and plenty of experts in the room, has been a challenge for the U.S. before Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard, right? So on election day, Tom Patterson at Harvard has these nice data showing that in the 2000 election, 2/3 of the American public couldn't accurately place the 2 presidential candidates on an issue as simple as gun control relative to one another on more or less restrictive policy. So that's always been a problem. But I think social media have put the big sort on steroids. They've basically allowed us to not just be geographically or based on ideology and religion, sorting ourselves into homogenous groups, but also do that online. And if I don't like what Meta is doing, then I'm going to Truth Social, where I get an even more purified version of my belief system. And it goes back to your Solomon Asch experiment from earlier, right? The reason why it works is because there's safety in my reference group, because it's safer to be surrounded by people who share my belief, even if that belief is factually wrong, than it is to be, and this echoes comments from all morning, why it is so important for to have diverse sets of voices that challenge our belief system. A lot of my early work was about heterogeneous networks and why discussion networks around us that are different in ideology, in belief, in socio-demographic makeup, make us more efficacious politically, make us more knowledgeable, and ultimately make us more participatory in politics, because we get our cage rattled on a regular basis. And social media, of course, is incentivized to do the exact opposite. I want to keep users engaged on the platform. I don't want them to go anywhere else. And so in order to do that, I don't want to rattle their cage, because otherwise they're going to jump to another app and the data is no longer collected on my platform. So the fiscal incentives are the exact opposite of what the democratic incentives are supposed to be. So that's why the yes and no answer, it's not a new problem, it's a problem on steroids.
Lee, in terms of the spread of misinformation through social media, what are the mechanisms by which this happens, and what are the strategies that one could use to actually combat falsehood on social media?
Yeah. It's important to remember that social media doesn't just allow for broadcasting, but also narrowcasting. After 20 clicks, it said they know you better than your spouse. And they use that to sell cosmetics and backpacks and hatred and polarize us over scientific issues. So it's important to remember that the people who are doing this, if they're malign actors, can manipulate your thinking when they know you're online and what you're looking at. It's also important to remember that people don't wake up one day wondering whether the California wildfires are caused by a Jewish space laser. It doesn't just suddenly occur to them that there might be microchips in the COVID vaccines. Those are falsehoods that are fed to them deliberately by someone who wants them to believe it. I'll talk about one of the examples there. We've all heard the ridiculous idea that there would be microchips in the COVID vaccines. Where did that come from? Well, you can trace it back and find very early on, there was a story in an online publication called the Oriental Review in April 2020. Now think about that. March 2020, first COVID, and then April 2020, which said that any future COVID vaccines that were developed in the West would contain tracking microchips, courtesy of Bill Gates, who held patent 666 on that technology. Well, okay. This was April 2020. At the bottom of that story, it said, share on Facebook, share on Twitter. And when it was later measured, they found that by May 2020, 28% of the American public thought that there was something to this idea. What didn't come out until much, much later is that the Oriental Review is one of 4 English language propaganda arms of the SVR, which used to be called the KGB. So how many lives were lost for this? Now, what was the interest behind that? The interest behind it was that the Russians had a competing vaccine, which was called the Sputnik. So if you don't think the national pride was on the line, but also the Asian and African market. I mean, that article was put out before they knew that there were going to be any vaccines. But they were already in a race to see who could come up with the first one because of the money that was at stake. So I think that, how do you combat this? The primary way that you combat it is sunlight. to let people know that they might be being disinformed. And one of the primary tools there is pre-bunking, to let people know, oh, you might be hearing some conspiracy theories about COVID vaccines. Here's why you shouldn't believe them, or here's what you should look out for. I mean, once people have already heard the disinformation and begun to spread it, it's almost a little bit too late. And so, the ability to get out there ahead of time with the truth and to repeat the truth and to have the truth repeated by trusted messengers, that's the best possible way to combat this. The danger is that social media is the greatest amplifying mechanism for propaganda that has ever been invented. Disinformation, the whole concept of disinformation was invented 100 years ago in Russia by V.I. Lenin, who appointed Felix Dzerzhinsky as the first head of the Cheka, which was the precursor organization to the KGB. So, I mean, it has been around for a long time, but social media is what allows it to spread. Can you get the disinformers to stop creating it? Probably not. Once it's released to the public, somewhat like a virus, can you stop the spread? Very hard. So what's our job? Clamp down on the amplification. Try to keep it from getting out to people. And one way you do that is to have a competing message of truth that's out there.
Mm-hmm. So yes, pre-bunking is certainly a really interesting tactic for addressing conspiracy theories. We're going to hear a bit more later today about conspiracy theories and AI approaches, which is another approach that Dave Rand and others are adopting. I guess pre-bunking has the challenge that it's hard to kind of anticipate exactly what the future conspiracy theory is likely to be in all its beautiful details.
Who would ever thought, if you'd ever hear anything about a Jewish space laser, don't believe it. I mean, no, you'd never come up with something like that. But you might begin to try to educate people in advance for the mRNA vaccines that were coming. What a great breakthrough. Now, be careful. There will be conspiracy theories about this. Or, it's a teachable moment, not just about the efficacy of the vaccines, but about conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Lily, I want to come back to the question of trust, because I know this is a big topic for you, and trust and trustworthiness, especially in our institutions. You mentioned the Pew Research. Many people think, okay, we're experiencing a crisis in trust in scientists, but actually it's growing. This is a surprising thing. We have 76% trust, reasonable or high trust in the credibility of scientists right now. It's not as high as pre-COVID levels, which was, I think, 86% or thereabouts, but it is on the way back up. So there seems to be a larger than popularly understood trust in our scientists, but nonetheless, apparently a deep distrust in some of our institutions, and which can you talk a little bit more about this in relation to polarization and what do you see happening in terms of trust in institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues that we have to grapple with is that trustworthiness isn't necessarily correlated with trust. And here, misinformation and disinformation are absolutely part of the problem. But providing better information and accurate information doesn't necessarily fix the problem. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is research that shows that people somehow lose their ability to consume science and data when something is politically motivated or politically sensitive. So Dan Kahan, who is at Yale, has done a really interesting study where he gets people to look at data in tables, and you have to be able to read the ratio of positive outcomes as the result of some intervention to the negative outcomes. And so when you're told that the table is about the impact of a skin cream on a rash, people can interpret the table perfectly accurately. But when you're told that the data in the table is about the impact of gun control on crime, people stop. It's as if people stop understanding the statistics and they lose their ability to read the table, and they answer that the table supports whatever political view that they happen to have. And so the problem, again, is that I think, or I as a scientist, I'm often focused on trying to convince people that I'm trustworthy, that my science is good, it's as accurate as I can make it, it's reliable, and I am not thinking, I'm thinking much less about what is it that actually would make people trust me, which comes back to my initial comments about values. Mm-hmm. What people really want to know is that I respect their values. I might not share all of their values. I mean, best if I share some of their values, but at least I respect their values. And that, I think, is actually one of the keys to understanding how to build trust both in institutions and in science and scientists.
Mm-hmm. And yes, Dietram, do you want to follow up on that?
Just really quickly to jump in there, because Dan Kahan's work I think really fits super well, but I think very often when we think about this, we have this, this is how people function. This is how all of us function, and which is exactly what you're saying. But there's a great study in PNAS where they show research on gender biases in academia, which are prevalent and continue, unfortunately, to persist both in terms of pay and everything else. And when you show that research to academics, male academics are much more likely to rate that research as lower quality. Why? Classic motivated reasoning, right? It challenges my priors. I'm not a sexist. I'm not behaving that way, so the data must be wrong, or the data are wrong. And so the point being, we as academics do the exact same thing that a climate denier, as we would call them, would do when they question climate research, because it doesn't fit their priors or the policy implications of those priors. And I think that's it just, for me, that's always a very powerful reminder that the exact same biases that I claim different publics out there have are ones that influence my decision making as well.
Mm-hmm. And just to move more into the kind of practical solutions space, if one is, we've heard a lot about challenges in communicating science with a polarized audience. We heard from Francis Collins earlier about the learnings from COVID in terms of presenting science that was still in the making and still unfolding with too high a degree of certainty, and how that in a way could have had significant negative implications for the way the public then approached vaccines and other aspects of the pandemic. But what are good tactics to use if you were to take all the people in this room? What should people go out with in terms of ideas of smart strategies to engage quite polarized audiences around scientific topics, controversial scientific topics? Maybe you'd like to start, Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I think one heartening piece of research that I've seen is a paper by Kathleen Hall Jameson at Penn that talks about how important science curiosity is. And so this is what is so wonderful about what all of you do, which is that it's not, as Dietram is saying, it's actually not that people who are scientifically educated or informed or whatever are less likely to have bias, but what their paper finds is that it's people who are curious about science that are less likely to have bias. Mm-hmm. So those are people who seek out documentaries, seek out television shows or news articles, and are just interested in scientific discoveries. And so the more that we can support that through science communication and science education in schools, I think that is actually going to be one really, really important thing to cultivate, and that can overcome this kind of motivated reasoning, motivated numeracy, motivated literacy that we see. The other piece of this, again, I think is just communicating more convincingly to the general American public or the general public that scientists are not a political interest group. And this maybe connects to one of the questions at the end of the previous panel or the previous session, that it's pretty striking the number of Americans who think of scientists and universities as a political interest group. And whatever scientists, universities, and science communicators can do to combat that is going to be also really helpful. And then third, once again, just communicating that scientists and science do not have a disdain for faith, religion, other value systems, that even when we don't share those value systems, we have a basic respect for them.
But so it's so interesting what you're saying in terms of also the idea that scientists should not be presented as a specific interest group. And, I often think there's a tension in terms of things like, even, our keynote speaker was very prominent at the Stand Up for Science event on Friday. And these seem like really important events, but is there a risk that by becoming activists that scientists risk actually confirming the prejudice that exists that scientists belong to a political interest group? Dietram, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a key distinction between scientists being political actors and contributing to the political discourse, which is not just unavoidable, it's actually desirable. But there's a difference between being political and being partisan. And the moment we're being seen, and then some survey data, these were not Pew data, these were NRC data at the University of Chicago, showed that in 2022, you saw this widening gap between Republicans and Democrats when it came to trust in science. And it was driven partly by declines among 70% of the population. These were independents and Republicans. But that gap is largely driven by Democrats having historical high numbers for trust in science, because for them, being pro-science had become a signaling device that you weren't for Trump. Trump was against science and Democrats were for science. And the moment we portray, and this goes back to Lily's point earlier as well, about perceptions, rightful or not, of academic institutions as liberal bastions, the moment we're seen as a set of partisan actors, we're going to get the exact same treatment on trust that all other institutions are getting that are perceived that way, meaning we're going to see rapid declines of trust. At the moment, we continue to benefit from a claim that we have and that we need to maintain, that we're unique arbiters of knowledge, creators, curators, and arbiters of knowledge in society. And we're not partisan, it's objective, it's neutral. And that's why we share something with the military in terms of stable levels of public trust, and we haven't seen the same declines. But the moment we are seen as partisan players, we're going to start dipping in exactly the same way. Then we just become one of many scientific institutions, and that's not what we are. That's not what we should be, and that's not, and this goes back to the very earlier point about why are we worth this significant investment, societal investment in biomedical research, one where we get large amounts of money, we distribute it based on rules that we come up with sometimes very uncertain outcomes, serendipitous outcomes. That's a big ask to make, and we cannot make this ask from across the political aisle unless we're not seen as partisan actors. That's why I see the real danger, and that's why Marches for Science, I really do like the idea, and I want to like the idea, and they make me cringe every time a Trump needs a brain transplant sign goes up, because that's where that idea goes off the rails pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Lee, from your point of view, in an age of polarization, should scientists become activists?
Well, it depends on what you mean by activists. I mean, scientists should become more active, but the way I think they might become more active is by meeting more people. I forget the source, but I read one time that it was a shockingly high number of people had never met a scientist. Not only, and I think it's a separate source, that they couldn't name a scientist, but they had never met a scientist. So rather than just doing the March for Science, why don't scientists have business cards that they're handing out at the grocery store, their PTA group, so that people, when they have a scientific question, they can call them? There was some research done a few years ago about that showed, I wrote a book called How to Talk to a Science Denier. And what it showed is that the worst possible way to convince someone to give up their denialist beliefs or to convince you to trust them was, elite online communication. The best way was face-to-face, conversation, that's where trust is built. And there are empirical studies which show that people, for instance, who didn't want to take the MMR vaccine, when they were taken seriously, had a chance to ask their questions, met a scientist, they would report back things like, well, yeah, I changed my mind because that person was so warm and they took the time with me and they answered all of my questions. I think that's what makes a difference. You have to meet people where they are, and online is hard. Here I'm going to tell a very quick personal story. In November 2018, I went to the Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, Colorado. Talk about the mouth of the lion's den. Because I wanted to hear what they had to say, but I wanted to also speak with them and see if I could test the hypothesis that all science denial was the same. That is, that they all reasoned the same way: climate deniers, evolution deniers, vaccine deniers. And by and large, the answer to that was yes. But here's the shocking thing. The flat earthers thought they were scientists. They would not say that they were against science. They would say they were against bad science. Or when one of them asked me on the first day when I was trying to keep my mouth shut and just listen, Lee, what's your belief? Why are you here? I'd say, I'm a skeptic. And said, me too. Well, okay, but we probably mean something different by that. But the second day when I started to speak to them, they were thrilled that I was there because somebody was taking them seriously and talking with them face to face. I had the good sense not to engage them about questions of physics, which they were already prepped on. They already knew, you know, some of them had read the Principia. I don't think they understood it. But wow. What I talked to them about was their pattern of reasoning. You know, why would you believe that? Well, why would you believe this photo from NASA was faked, but not that photo from this other person that you saw online? And so, you know, once you engage people with a smile on your face and they know who you are, I think they begin to build trust. And so if more scientists got out in the community, you don't have to go to a flat earth convention. I'm not sure I'd recommend it. But you can find people where, you know, you're not going to find them in the lab. You're not going to find them at the March for Science. Most of the people at the March for Science already agree that science is a great thing. And I went to the March for Science in Boston when we had it. I think it was, I forget the year, but make those business cards, make an effort to speak to people, because scientists really are warm and delightful and curious people. And the public doesn't know that. And I think if they knew that, there would be more trust.
Well, this is music to my ears, of course, as the director of the MIT Museum, where, you know, igniting curiosity and humanizing science through face-to-face encounters are really at the core of our philosophy. And, you know, having these places where one can actually create that interface and that human face of science, or where somebody gets a chance to speak to in person to an MIT student and, you know, get fired up and see that it's, yeah, as you say, it's not something faceless and it's not some online argument, but actually embodied encounters are really important. But yeah, you know, we're in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is obviously a little bit of a bubble. How can we scale that to the rest of the country is really a big question. But I would like to open it up to the audience now. You know, this is an important topic, and I know we also have questions online. So yes, I'll start with you, sir. Yeah. There's a microphone going around.
Thank you. So I want to speak to or I want to ask about the gap in trust in science that is being derived from the fact that scientists do not, in fact, look like, come from, or inhabit the value systems, or just even sort of the life experience of the people that we want to have trust. Sort of there's a short-term solution kind of thing, and then there's the long-term solution. I mean, I know you cited 21 or 25 R1s in rural areas. So I was hoping you could sort of give your thoughts on what is both a short-term kind of how do we fix this for the now, and then what does institutional fixes to change that pipeline look like so that in 25 years we're still not having this conversation?
Wonderful question. Lily, would you like to
I'll take it first. I mean, I think that Fixing it for the now has to do with what Michael is saying about, humanizing, and what Lee was talking about in terms of face-to-face, humanizing. I think maybe I am a little bit more pessimistic about the ability of, me and my colleagues to be like warm and human sometimes, but maybe that's just me. But if all of you can help us do that, all to the better. But I think some of it is warmth, and of course, those who study science communication and political communication generally talk about trust as being decomposed into warmth and expertise, right? And we focus too much on the expertise, and could we focus more on the warmth part? So that I think is the short term. Some of it is also maybe thinking in the medium term about alternative platforms and changing the social media platforms that do exist, because they are just inherently hot, and can we have slower, cooler, less viral ways of communicating? Can we inculcate like a sense that social media platforms are bad for public health, and that to improve public health we actually need different forms of communication and exchange? So short term, medium term, but the long term I think really is rethinking how to bring science to every small town and community, and to have it be something that is fun and exciting. And so I think about things like the fact that agricultural extension, used to be one way in which science was out there, and people knew about it. And we don't have that anymore, of course. It's far, far less relevant than it used to be. I saw a production of Our Town. I don't know if any of you read that in high school, by Thornton Wilder. And I was struck by the fact that, this play about a small town, in it, they're like, the smartest kid ever to come from our town went to Massachusetts Technology. And it was this huge, wonderful, sort of prestigious thing, positive thing, and you just don't get that anymore. I was sort of contrasting that with a report I read about something that's called the STARS Alliance, I think, where MIT and other universities have partnered to bring admissions officers to small towns and communities, and they were saying actually that the MIT admissions officer was saying that they went to this small community and there was nobody in line. They had never experienced that before. Like every other kind of recruiting event or pipeline event they had been to, huge long line for MIT. At these small towns and communities, nothing. Nobody was interested, which then I think rolls back to science in K through 12, where science and math in K through 12 and these kinds of small towns and communities is just doubly important. I often think that there's sort of both a gender and a disciplinary bias for the humanities at the K through 12 level. And how do we get sort of, more math and science teachers who are like committed to K through 12 education?
But I think the question was also, if I understand it correctly, about identity and about the question of, do we, in a way, need to think about having people communicating around science who share identity with the people they're engaging with.
Yes,
And I see, for example, Phil Sharp in the audience, Phil grew up in a small town in Kentucky, do we need to Phil to be in Kentucky rather than here in Cambridge?
I mean,
engaging with one thinks of Catherine Hayhoe, who is from Texas and is an amazing climate communicator and has the Texan accent and everything. And how important is it actually to really think about shared identity in terms of science communication?
I mean, if I just might add, I think that's where I was starting with the agricultural extension and those stories where, Yale University, for example, used to be very, very well known for training small town lawyers, judges, and doctors who went back to their small towns. Mm-hmm. We don't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. Like, we don't go back to our small town. I was born in Oklahoma, and I'm living here, right? So I think that is absolutely a part of the issue.
Dietram, maybe very briefly, because I want to take the online question.
Let's keep going then.
Yes, Kara, please, online question.
So for the audience questions, I'm going to rapid fire a few so that you guys can just, don't all answer them. Just take the ones that feel relevant to you, because there's a few on here that would be fun to get to in the short time we have. So one anonymous viewer mentioned that, we've talked about the role of humility and listening to the lived experiences of people as science communicators, but how can we encourage scientists themselves to adopt these more reflective practices instead of just saying, do it? Right? To an earlier point that was made also, how do we demonstrate that we respect someone's values in a social climate where disagreement is automatically seen as disrespect? And then one more that I want to add to that was, I understand Lee's comment on the need to answer questions to science denialists, but sometimes those conversations become exhausting. Where do we trace the line between engagement and spending hours debunking disinformation? And I even want to kind of add a slight thing to that. You mentioned earlier the difference between mis and disinformation, which I think is an important distinction. Should we be spending more time digging deep into the distinction between those nefarious actors and those who are victimized by those actors,
yes,
instead of treating them as if they themselves are those actors?
Yeah, I want to make that clear, right? There are the people who are creating the disinformation, the people who believe it, right, and the people who are amplifying it in the middle. Different strategies, right? Very much so. The people who believe the disinformation are victims, and we should have sympathy for them. Mm-hmm. They're being hurt by this. And so I don't go into those conversations trying to debunk, with hard facts. That's, for one thing, it's not going to work. For one thing, it is disrespectful. What I do is I go in looking for commonality. We do have more commonality than we think. We probably know more science deniers than we think. One thing that look, I'll get personal for a minute. I mean, science saved my life. I would have been dead 5 years ago if it hadn't been for science. How many of you in this room would be dead today if it had not been for science? Please raise your hand. Look at that. Look at that. So that's something that we probably have in common with, a lot of the people that we're talking to. I encourage scientists, everybody who cares about science, to tell more stories. We don't just believe in science. Look, stories are sometimes what convince people, not arguments. I love hearing the origin story from scientists about why they became a scientist, what sparked them to become a scientist. That will sometimes work. That will sometimes get people excited. I got interested in science when I was just very tiny, when my mom, who never went to college, would wrap me up on a cold night and run outside and look at the stars. And it was a challenge because Portland, Oregon, so you didn't see the stars all the time. But we would look at the stars, and I was a curious kid, and so I said, "What are the stars?" And she said, "Well, they're just suns. They're very far away." I said, "So our sun is a star?" "Yes." "Does that mean that all the stars have planets?" And she looked up and said, "Probably. We just haven't found them yet." This was 1968. They hadn't found them yet. And so I said, then my next question I remember, "So how many do you think?" And she said, "Probably all of them." Now, that's a nice origin story that you all have. You all have some reason why you got interested in science. If you share that with somebody who's maybe not trustworthy or not interested in science, that might help them. It might help to humanize you and to find that. So it's not about facts or confrontation, because people will feel disrespected. I don't think anybody feels disrespected by a story about how you got interested in science.
Dietram, do you want to?
I'll jump in really quickly on the humility one, because I think that's a really important one. And this came up again and again today, the idea of listening. Listening without the possibility of change is not listening, right? And I think for scientists, that's very hard to grasp. We like to listen to understand values and then have better persuasive strategies to get people over to our side. We like to listen to hear concerns and really meaningfully speak to them, not in order to close our labs. So the idea of humility, if executed right, means that science and different public stakeholders will have to meet somewhere that is not by definition where science started out, especially for these wicked problems, as they're often called, that we're dealing with. Again, embryonic stem cell research was an early iteration of, but CRISPR applications, human brain organoids, AI, all fall into that. They don't have best answers that science can provide. They have answers and applications in society that we need to socially negotiate. And real humility and real listening means that we may not go ahead with certain areas of science, right? And there are precedents for that. Pacific Grove and other meetings where scientists themselves kind of put the kibosh on some work that was moving forward. But for me, that's a really important part. And unless we're willing to really listen with the possibility of changing our mind, we shouldn't be calling it listening.
Yeah, that's very well said. I completely agree with that. And I think I might just add that, the comment that disagreement is often seen as disrespect is such a insightful one. And I think there, the one way to communicate respect is genuine curiosity, and with this possibility of changing one's mind. Because again, we're often focused on the facts, the knowledge, the evidence. Don't you understand that the evidence says X? But that conversation is actually not the conversation that should, ideally be happening, which is that you value X. Tell me why you value X, and let me see whether we can connect about how the science, the research helps you to achieve those values X, even if I don't agree with those values X.
Okay. I think there's another question over here from the audience. Yeah. Sound.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so thank you so much. What an amazing conference, and so timely. I will also start with a story. I think it was last week. Stefan Lewandowski, who's one of the miscommunication, leaders in the miscommunication and cognitive science research, organized a workshop, mostly for European, psychologists and scientists, on how to do science in a totalitarian regime. They had cybersecurity experts. They had, speakers who did research in Russia, Hungary, etc. And at that workshop, it hit me what a dangerous moment we're in now. And Dr. Collins talked about it in his remarks, and all of you are alluding to this. So I'm being practical about this. I started a nonprofit last year after about 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm a physician, a scientist. And I would like to propose that our nonprofit take the lead on organizing this coordinated effort that someone asked about on the other side, unless somebody else is already doing that. So our nonprofit is called Eviva Partners, EVIVA. If you're interested, please let me know, or if you know of other similar efforts. We are very strict about confidentiality. We have about 40 people who already reached out, but they didn't want to be publicly known, so we are very strict about that, using kind of, cyber safe platforms, etc. So just wanted to make a plug for this.
Okay. And so if anyone's interested, please talk to, what's your name again, sorry?
Alex Morozov.
Please talk to Alex. But questions? Yes. Over here, can we get the microphone? Yeah.
Oh, we have one. Sorry. Next.
So yeah, please keep the questions a little bit brief, because we're running out of time. Yeah.
I'll ask the whole panel, including yourself, Michael, if I could grant each of you $1 billion, how would you incentivize the community engagement that I've heard spoke about? What infrastructures would you build for scientists to be more involved? What other things could we put in place if we had unlimited time and resources?
Fantastic question. I suggest we come back to that right at the end because that's a beautiful thing to end with. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ann Capola. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm a physician. I'm also, for now, at least an NIH-funded researcher. And I am a senior editor at JAMA. My question has to do with physicians and clinicians more broadly, nurses, pharmacists as science communicators. I think there's a lot of reluctance for us to be science communicators because of the concern of getting into confrontation of where the politics aligns with the science. At the same time, we have some of those interpersonal one-on-one interactions face-to-face with our patients. So advice for how to help clinicians overcome this concern about a confrontation when trying to talk about the power of science.
I think we have time for just one person to answer that. Who would like to take a shot at it? Yeah?
The first thing you need to do is not presume that you know why they're resisting. I would say listen, because it may be a different reason than you would expect. Sometimes if you just let people talk, they will tell you what they need to hear to become convinced. They will, once they feel heard, they're more open to becoming convinced. But sometimes they will also say outright, if, this is, what I've never been able to overcome. And then, if you've got the data, that might be easier.
Great. Each of you has $1 billion. You want to address the issue of polarization in relation to science. What would you spend it on? Lily?
I have to be honest. I don't know exactly how to answer that question because I don't feel that it's an issue of money. So, I would actually love to hear what my colleagues think about that.
Okay,
so
passing the buck to you.
I would agree that it's not just a question of money. I'll take I'll take a little bit of that money but it's going to be much cheaper than $1 billion. And there have been efforts to do this. But the most exciting thing that we're seeing at Wisconsin is people from STEM fields. We have a PhD minor in science communication. We have a grad certificate. We have an undergrad certificate in science communication. And we're seeing students who are pre-med, who are genetics, who are engineers, who are building programs where the next generation of scientists is much more acutely aware of their need to be in meaningful, constant, engaged dialogue with society than I ever was, I can promise you that. But for them to have programs that they can engage with academically as they go through college, as they go through a master's program, or an MD or PhD program, and then go out with transcriptal and expertise in that area has been invaluable. And these have been our fastest growing programs, not because we've created, maybe because we've created something special, but because these students are looking for this. So there was an effort that others have spearheaded to try and build some of that into a lot of grad programs. I think that's where a chunk of that $1 billion could go, really build infrastructure there.
Thank you.
Okay, so
very short.
In 20 seconds, I can tell you how I would spend all $3 billion.
10. You can have 10.
Okay. Not just graduate students, but practicing scientists need to learn how to do this. And there are two outstanding places that already do just what you said. One is the Alan Alda Center at SUNY Stony Brook, and the other is the Center for Public Engagement with Science at University of Cincinnati. If I had $1 billion, I would found 100 of those across the country at different universities. They teach scientists how to talk with the general public.
So scale up science communication training. I would add to that a mobile MIT museum on the road all around the country. Every MIT museum, MIT student gets science communication training. I think the future could be bright. I want to mention that if you're interested in this topic of polarization and science communication, there will be a lunch hosted by Peter Kaufman today. So there's only a small number of places, and our panelists will be there, so you can continue the conversation. I want to then invite you to join me in warmly thanking our panelists, Lily, Dietram, and Lee. Thank you.
Thank you.